Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gnostic Media's UnSpun, episode number 89. I'm your host, Jan Irvin, back with Bill Joslin tonight. Wanted to say thanks first before we dive in. Episode number 89. I'm your host, Jan Irvin, back with... There we go. I had to mute that. Started feeding back through, but I wanted to mention a few things before we dive in, Bill. Got a... letter from Justin today, and I want to congratulate Justin first off because before he started listening to the show, he weighed, get this, Bill, 569 pounds.
Wow.
He's now down to his 380s and on his way down from cutting grains, listening to the show, getting on a high-fat diet, turning his health around, running for governor or mayor of his small town.
Oh, fantastic.
But he sent a letter and a little donation, wanted to congratulate him. Also, thanks to Camille for sending her donation in the mail today. I appreciate that. I love getting, I appreciate all the donations, but it's really nice to open the mail and get an actual handwritten letter from someone. And, this guy, it's like, wow.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I actually received a gift from the last show as well, from Jeff, some pipe tobacco and stuff. Thank you so much. I was very touched by that.
Absolutely. And it means a lot because we've done, it's like, you and I have been friends for a long time, but I almost died in the hospital in 2009. I was in the ICU for 5 days. It was my son's third birthday, when I was told that basically they didn't expect me to live through the night, but they had finally figured out what was wrong with me. So I went from about 111 pounds to 165 and off all the meds, off everything. But, it's just getting that it's the grains that they're keeping us sick with. It's the low-fat diet. Mm-hmm. Eating fresh vegetables, all the soy products, all the beans too. It's all of the plants high in poisonous lectins. But anyway, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again. I was hoping to get a little bit more into, or to clarify a little bit more on the Sheepdog Nomocracy side, the political side, and hopefully maybe into a little bit of the epistemology. There were some comments that came up around my talking about monopoly on violence. So I think I left it unexplained to the degree that people may have had some confusion about it. And I think the other thing that we didn't get into very much, I think we mentioned it a couple of times, but we didn't really explicitly talk about it, was the notion of a confederacy of sovereign men, that idea of everybody as sheriff. So I was hoping to go from there, because I think when we initially talked about it, that was the thing that caught your interest as well, was this notion of everybody a sheriff and the distribution of judicial, power. Okay. So the concept stack that I use in terms of how a civilization or how a society is created, like a formal society that has institutions and so on, was we touched upon it a little bit, where it's that notion of clearing a terrain of its violence, and to do that means that you hold a monopoly on violence. So you either kill off all the competitors or fight them all back. Nobody else can challenge you. You're the de facto guy. You're the only one that isn't beholden to anybody else because you hold the power of force. Now, you can use that any number of ways. You can use that to enslave other people. You can use that to protect other people. You can use that to start building institutions and so on. So the notion of a monopoly of violence isn't to say that Sheepdog Nomocracy is about a monopoly on violence. It's to say that it's a core component of civilization. That if you're going to have agreements or rules or whatever within your society, you need a way to enforce it. And the way to enforce it means that you need to have a monopoly on violence to some extent. It's really a matter of what happens with that monopoly once it's established.
And how do you keep it in check?
Keep it in check and balance, and then that's so the notion then is, well, if nobody had that force, whether it's a group of people or one person or whatever, if nobody had that ability with force, then nobody else would get screwed over. But then what happens is now you're left wide open to be screwed over by everybody. So if you have a monopoly of force that's being used for good and justice, it preserves the laws and maintains sort of a clearing for high trust. Somebody's there to enforce the law or execute on remuneration when there's a conflict that happens or some sort of breakdown in civil order. Or you can use it to screw everybody over. And I think the big shift, well, let me back up a little bit. There's a number of ways that we move the world, how we affect the world. And this is, and I don't just mean in some sociological sense with each other. We either move it physically, literally physical force to move something. We can do it socially through agreement and cooperation, or I can offer you something to do something with me, and that affects a change in the world. Cooperate, or we can do it through information. So I can give you information, or I can learn information, and from that I can change the world. So think of it in those three broad categories. There's physical coercion of the world, social, and informational. And this isn't exclusive to humans. I'm actually drawing this from studies on chimpanzees and troop leaders. They can either have everybody scared of them and be the tyrant, and that keeps their troop together, or they can sit there and go through grooming rituals with every member in that troop, and out of the bonds that he develops with the troop keeps the group cohesion. And the one that I found humorous was this tiny little ape that figured out that tin cans made a lot of noise, and he could rattle the tin cans and scare everybody else away. And he ended up being troop leader because of it. So he had these little, and he would be a trickster. He'd come out of the bush at people and scare them away and stuff. So he was using intellect or information to maintain control or group cohesion. Each one of those has a survival strategy behind it. So coercing the world through physical force roughly is predation. I'm going to kill you and take your stuff. Or I can betray a trust that we've established to seek resources from you, or freeload to some extent. So it's parasitism. You need a host, and then you can slowly draw from the host as long as they tolerate it. And this is a way of gaining resources, gaining that asymmetrical benefit that we need to stay alive. Or you can do it through cooperation. So really what we're talking about when we're talking about a just society is that we're limiting strategies, human strategies to get resources, to cooperation alone. We're isolating out predation with the monopoly on violence, and we have yet to have a society that's isolated away parasitism.
That's
right?
for sure.
And that's the big shift in the Enlightenment from monarchs to constitutional monarchy was where we really kind of got a good control over predation, where we had laws that people could get behind. We had a flourishing of cooperation, but we also, out of establishing these parliaments and everything else, we set up the perfect system for parasitism. And that's what we're in right now, is a system that rewards people that can move the world through persuasion and perception, not reality, not ability. The only ability that they have that's better than anybody else's is their ability to manipulate other people. They're parasites. So when we criticize the state of the world, and we start criticizing these things that we've worked out, like separation of powers or separation of church and state, checks and balances, these were all ways that we dealt with predation and physical force, to separate the police from the military and the judges from the police and so on, was a way of dealing with the threat of tyrannical physical force, overt slavery and so on. But what we haven't dealt with is this notion of parasitism, rent seeking within our civilizations.
And then it's like you have these secret society groups that form brotherhoods behind the scenes as well.
Well, and that's exactly what I mean, is that we created a system where that sort of influence became a high reward way of exerting political control. If you look at the geopolitics today and how most of our governments are influenced from a dark state, these were all established, essentially by the Rhodes Network 100 years ago, that is now accepted as just how our governments work. So we have the notion of a lobbying group that will actually write laws and give them to a congressperson to present in Parliament. Well, that was never the intention of how our systems would work. Here in Canada, it's the bureaucrats. It's not so much lobbying groups, but it's bureaucrats, academia into bureaucrats. And then the bureaucrats exert this plutonic control over the MPs. Well, we've come so far downstream from that we just accept it. That's just the way our governments work, even though they're incredibly unjust because of it. And it's because we have a system that has opened that door and reinforces that particular type of strategy, which is a strategy through parasitism, through lies and deception and rent seeking and manipulation and reframing, that all originated with these original secret societies. This was their means of exerting control over
and that would have to include things like usury, Marxism, socialism. Yeah. You see the LGBT QWERTY community out there pushing this whole agenda these days. So
what is it they're doing? Because this will get closer to the mechanism on how this operates. What they're doing is they're seeking special rights.
Right.
So they're seeking parliamentary support to legislate in certain rights to give them an advantage over others. Well, how is that even possible? Well, it's possible because our parliaments hold a monopoly on violence, and we have to make a distinction that the monopoly on violence is not about rulership. It's about conflict resolution. It's about the judiciary. It's not about where roads are going to be built or who gets the city contract for removing garbage. So what we've done is we've taken management of the commons, the communal property that's managed by an institution that we call our government, and we've collapsed that with the rule of law. We've made them one and the same thing. So now they can use the force behind the rule of law that's there to protect high trust circumstances, so that they can exert all of their strategies behind it. And what we need to do is deconflate those two things and say we don't need the force of law to go behind what are really just basic managerial tasks. What company's going to get one contract and where budgets go. You don't need to have the monopoly on violence to get those things done. But we have them all in one hand, and when you do that, now politicians have a product to sell. They have the power to use force to execute a particular will. That creates a product that they can then sell to special interests.
And that's the whole thing with affirmative action as well. It's to give other groups an advantage over everybody else.
Yeah, and as soon as you do that, the predictability behind how the law operates starts to decline. Decisions start to be made on arbitrary or trivial means, which means people start to lose faith in it, and it begins the process of a breakdown on one of the core pillars of society, which is this necessity for us to have an agreement on how we're going to live together and have the ability to enforce that agreement or maintain it. So like I said in the last show, the notion of equality before the law was how is this force going to be used within the polis? Well, it has to be used in a way that's not arbitrary, that's not trivial, it's not discretionary. It's not just somebody saying, well, I'm going to do this today and not tomorrow, where nobody can predict it. So the notion of equality before the law was just to say that there are going to be set rules on how this force is going to be used, and it'll apply to everybody. And then when that happens, now people know what's expected of them. They can calm down into that set of rules. Well, as soon as you start introducing special rights, you no longer have equality before the law. You have this set of laws for this group of people, this set of laws for that group of people, and you're starting to slip back into this arbitrary discretionary rule, which breaks down trust again. It breaks down, essentially it breaks down our willingness to participate in a social contract. So this is the notion behind negative rights versus positive rights. As soon as you define a positive right, anything that's not
let me give an example. Here in California, we have this guy, Governor Jerry Twinkletoes Moonbeam, and so he was the governor of California back in the 60s, 70s. He's been the governor again, and this last week he passed a law that if you do not address the proper gender pronoun of these QWERTY transgender people when they're in the medical system, then the healthcare professionals will now go to prison. So now they are, if somebody is sick or ill and they're treating them and they accidentally say, excuse me, sir or ma'am, then they will go to jail for this. I mean, this is the erosion of freedom of speech, of common sense. I mean, this is, just going into the absurd of this. Now, Governor Twinkletoes wants to control the very words we're allowed to speak. And this is only the first step in medical care. You can guarantee Twinkletoes and these people have a whole line of this stuff ready to roll out.
Well, they passed M103 here in Canada about this time last year. And now it's being proposed as a law, which is the exact same thing. It's if you misgender somebody under the motion, you could deal with fines and so on, but now under the law, it could be more serious consequences. Not to mention that in Canada, I don't think very many Canadians know what's going on in our legal system. We have social justice tribunals here and human rights tribunals that are a parallel legal system to our common law system. And so under common law, you're innocent until proven guilty. The key word there being proven, and innocent prior to that. And the tribunals operate off a thing called 50+1. And it's a 50% plus one probability that the victim felt some sort of injury. And that's what constitutes guilt. So it doesn't even matter if you've done something or not. What matters is if the complainant felt that you did something wrong and has suffered from it. So the but it's an arbitrary suffer. It's an emotional suffering that can't be looked at and examined. Well, it includes that, and that's the issue: is that it includes things like emotional distress or things that are harder to quantify, and that's a serious issue. It's a serious issue. One, when we start removing things like a burden of proof and lowering the criteria for innocence or guilt. And it's also a very serious issue to have a parallel legal system going on at the same time. That, you can throw your hands up and say, well, it's a tribunal, it's not a judge, it doesn't have the weight of law behind it. Well, it does have the weight of law behind it, because if you don't abide by whatever their resolution is, then you become in contempt of that court. And then that's when the common law system steps in. So these are serious issues that I think maybe 1% of 1% of Canadians are aware of what's going on. I mean, there was a note that was sent out last week to the Bar Association here in Ontario that required lawyers to write down an assessment of their social justice stance. So you better believe that if your social justice stance doesn't fit with the predominant liberal thought, there's going to be ramifications for your career there. So it has a huge chilling effect on the diversity of ideas and conversation and the need to debate verbally when somebody's career is under threat. And then not to mention that person's career is a critical component of a legal system that either puts criminals away or keeps you safe from the state, you know. And the one area that I wasn't upset about in Canada was our judges and defense attorneys seem to still have a strong sense of the principles behind common law held as principles. They're not just scammers in the system. And they're getting very old, especially the judges, and they're going to be retiring soon. And the people that are coming up behind them are coming right out of these social justice courses that at its core is trying to dismantle Western civilization and institutions of Western civilization and rebuild it in some sort of utopian image, this egalitarian image. And it's really scary. This isn't, we're not LARPing here when we're saying these things are really going on in the world. They have real ramifications. It's just that we're a couple of years ahead of normal people seeing what those ramifications are, you know?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So on that note about justice and rule of law and that whole notion, was this notion of everybody a sheriff and everybody a judge. That if we have one law, rather than 50 million laws, most of which were passed because they were a product being sold to some sort of special interest, if we have one law that gives us a means of deciding what to do in conflict, a measure, a commensurable measure, decidability in that situation, we don't need an institution for law. Every person can act as a judge or a sheriff. That if we all commit to upholding natural law, we can all be the enforcers of natural law and the arbitrators when conflicts come up. Yeah.
I was just going to mention, several years ago, I interviewed Paul Schrader, who is running for sheriff of San Bernardino County. You know, and that is the essence of what the U.S. Constitution gets at with the militia, with the sheriff being the supreme law of the land, etc. But it's, you know, it's gotten away from them. But, you know, the sheriff could deputize every male in the county.
And he could draw on the local militias as well.
Well, he was the head of the militias, and then he called them together for the defense. But not only that, when there was a criminal about, he called together the posse out of the militia. You know, but the trust relationship between the militia and the posse and the sheriff has been eroded away.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that you've had a number of centralizations of those institutions. Last week, I can't remember who it was, had passed around some videos about the constitutional militia and sort of the original documents behind the notion of a militia in the United States, which was fascinating. It was quite literally the only legitimate institution was the militia. The rest were secondary to it.
Right.
But you know, just
and you know, so what the media for the last 40, 50 years has spent a campaign of ridiculing the militia, rather, you know, and then we have this illegal or unconstitutional standing army that's taken the place of the militia, and then in its stead, a campaign of ridiculing the militia, when the militia is the true source of power held with the people, and that being the monopoly of violence, not this standing army under control of the president himself. But when the militia is the people themselves, and then the people vote directly for the sheriff. The sheriff heads the militia. Then you don't have the whole of the military underneath the president.
So you have power localized. You have first among peers, a sheriff elected by militiamen. So you have first among peers. It's not a high hierarchy with,
and he's married. He's married directly to the people too, because he's not associated to a party.
That's right.
He's elected directly out of the people.
Yeah, and it seems like these malicious societies that we were talking about before had a similar structure, where pretty much you could consider that everybody that was capable of doing battle were equal. So there's some degree of egalitarianism there, but you still need in any group you need a subset that acts as agency. Somebody needs to direct and make decisions, or be at least a final point of resolution for decisions. So they elect first among peers. He's not better or he's not higher. He's just elected.
He might have more experience.
Yeah. Or just be the one willing to take on responsibility.
And the one that's gained the highest trust relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
Of the local militia.
Yeah. And if he's not doing his job well, then those peers remove him and put another first among peers in there. So it's this notion that we need a hierarchy. We're always going to have a hierarchy. We're always going to have Pareto distributions. But how do we live with those Pareto distributions so that they're not causing damage? Well, this was one way. You have people that have qualified by their ability, as warriors. They've qualified for their ability to be the ones to make a choice for the leader of their warriors within their society, first among peers. So this notion of sheepdog nomocracy is that everybody within the society is an enforcer of natural law, and that the power is not centralized within an institution like a police force or a military. It is literally dispersed to everybody. If you are a citizen within that society, you are also a police officer.
And not to get people upset over the word citizen, excuse Bill for using that.
Yeah. So imagine being in a store and somebody tries to steal something and runs down the street, running away, trying to get away. Every person he'd be passing is a potential police officer.
Right.
Every person he's passing.
Well, and in the U.S., I'm not sure about Canada, but in the U.S., anyone, and most people don't even know this, anyone can put somebody under arrest.
Yeah, and we can here too. But the difference is our police force has special rights. I'm sure yours have special rights. Ours definitely have.
They're technically not supposed to. They're supposed to be equal to the people, but of course they fudge those lines.
So consider that everything that your police force has access to and is allowed to do is distributed to everybody within the society. You would start to see a social investment and a social cohesion like we haven't seen before.
And this is exactly how they circumvented the militia, and this social cohesion was to create an unlawful standing army, which then goes around that, and then it becomes the monopoly of power, and then it gains more power than all of the people as a whole combined.
Mm-hmm. And it's because they are the core of the power behind a state, which is the monopoly on force. So if we distribute the monopoly on force to the citizens, and anybody who's willing to take up that mantle, or anybody that's in that opportunity that must be executed, you now have that mechanism that's required to keep a society functioning, being the monopoly on force. But what makes it a monopoly isn't an institution, and it isn't a certain hierarchical structure. It's simply the agreement to uphold natural law. That if we are all involved in enforcing natural law, and we all in all of that, in that entire spectrum, from not only your own behavior but also enforcing it in other people, then we can start to have a society that has the institutional stability that we see in societies today, without the fuckery that we see coming from the top down, right? Uh, so that's sheepdog democracy, the notion that that the law is simple enough, and we can get into that law later, but it's simple enough to be able to interpret situations, to be able to give you some decidability on guilt or impositions and so on, that anybody can apply it and then distribute the power to the population. Now it's not like, well, here's the power. It's you need to be a militiaman. You need to be armed. You need to be trained. You need to be a threat.
It's just common sense when you look at it,
Yeah. And when that's distributed, then we can have a social cohesion.
And what boggles my mind, in this event in Vegas, with all this now, everybody's screaming, "Oh, we got to take the guns away! How dare they?" And so the propaganda is more than ever, and so they're this is a key thing that they have to get away from us to finally put the people down once and for all, because then there will be no means of fighting back.
That's right. Well, and to what degree do we have an ability to fight back? I mean, do you honestly think that the civilians can stand up and fight against a modern military force?
Oh, probably not. But I mean, at least
drag it out for a few decades. But
yeah,
I mean, the asymmetry in force is ridiculous right now. Yeah, I had another thought, but I lost it.
Sorry.
Okay, so that's trying to clarify monopoly on violence. Now let's look at the other thing that's been running through my mind is people have sort of a political slant that's highly built off of their own personality traits. Personality traits tend to give us constellation of values, and then one manifestation of those values is our political leaning. So if you look at, say, anarchists don't want any rulers at all, because rulers are going to come and screw you over, right? But in taking that stance, there's no cohesion to a monopoly on violence.
Right.
And there's no willingness to pay into that. And there's a suspicion that any kind of organization of that sort of thing is going to end up being another state. Well, it would be another state. So you'd be in your anarchist society, and one person out of the 2% that are always screwing things up for everybody else robs from somebody else or does something crappy, and now you have to deal with it. Well, and then that happens a couple more times, and the people that end up dealing it end up being kind of a de facto law enforcement anyway.
They become the sheriff and the posse, and then everything starts all over again, and then it's like...
That's right. And then you're back into something that resembles a state. It's just not called a state anymore. And in doing that, you also now don't have any of the checks and balance and constraints, or any of the lessons that we've learned over millennia of doing this. So you're going to have these things, because they're necessary components for people to live together, which is all about human conflict, human cooperation, and so on. And then you get libertarians that maybe they don't have too much of an issue with a police force or a military, but it's like, don't aggress against me, man. Just, we can trade and do business, but you do what you want to do. I want to do what I want to do. Just leave me alone. So really all they're seeking is opportunity. They don't want their opportunity to be screwed around with. So they don't want regulations. They don't want to be inferred upon. It's like, if I'm not hurting you, I should be able to pursue my opportunities. But then within that, those opportunities live within an environment, live within a context. And that context includes a society, and it includes shared values. It includes high trust circumstances for those opportunities to exist that they're not willing to pay for. So it's like, if I'm selling porn, I'm not hurting anybody. All my actors agreed. They've all consented. It's all voluntary. The people that buy from me, it's all voluntary. I haven't aggressed against anybody. You shouldn't have any right over what I'm doing. What they're not paying attention to is the social impact that has. the impact it has on families, the impact it has on young male brains, and so on, that they don't want to be responsible for. They just
Right.
want their opportunity. They just want the opportunity to extract wealth morally, but they don't want any of the other responsibility that goes along with that.
They don't want the moral responsibility for the ramifications of selling pornography.
Yeah,
You know, and just really quickly, I wanted to mention for those who haven't seen it, I've done a couple of shows with Gary Wilson on the damage that pornography does and how addicting it is and the social ramifications of that. Spit that out. But just to let people know, if they want more research, they should definitely check that out.
and that's only one example. Look at everything that you've looked at with the counterculture and the impact that that's had on society. Well, those are all social damages, damage the social commons.
Right.
And there's no way to hold those people accountable.
How do you hold, you know, an organization like the CIA accountable for selling all of this stuff? And
yeah, and want to talk about corporations a little bit later. So there's your anarchists don't want any state, you know, just leave me alone. Right? And then the libertarians just want their opportunity, don't interfere with my opportunity, but no responsibility. Then you have people that all they're about is the social responsibility, that everything is about social fabric, everything is about context. And this is where our socialists come from, our left-leaning people. They're all about the social environment and nothing to do with the individual. And what they're denying is personal agency, that nobody is an active agent. There is no free will. You're just a result of your society. So we need to write policies to change the society to match my morals and my values because I'm right, you know?
no, left.
Yeah, or left, yeah. And in any of these cases, if you look back in society, any society we've had, we've always sort of had those three factions going on: people seeking commerce, people seeking status, people seeking subsidy, because these are all survival strategies. These are all ways that humans can survive. We can survive through predation. We can survive through cooperation, or we can survive through parasitism.
Well, you know, and something you mentioned to me in a message last week on Facebook was that this is these three things are the breakdown of the political dynamics that we see out there today.
Yeah,
you know?
and what it boils down to is that they're the three most viable ways that a social creature can stay alive.
Well, let's go through. You know, generally, women are going to be social.
They're going to be social, and there's good reason for it. They need to raise kids and nurture kids. They can't be going out getting resources. So they seek subsidy. They seek resources from the father or from the greater community, and they must. So it's a consumptive strategy. They're all about consumption, and it's a short time horizon. I have to take care of my kid right now, and whatever the problems they are right now. So it's a short time horizon that's bent on consumption. Then you have sort of the young male strategy, which is that libertarian view, which is all about opportunity, and it's the opportunity really to rise in the hierarchy.
That's a nice way of saying beta males.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. So the beta males that want the opportunity to demonstrate that they can be alpha. So they're all about the opportunity. So it's like, you know, alpha, don't screw with me, but keep my opportunity for me to beat you out.
Be an alpha, right? Yeah.
Right. So it's a way of trying to get away from direct competition with the alpha. They tend to be.
And then the alpha. Did you mention the alpha tends to be the conservative of the group?
Yeah, it is the conservative. So the libertarian is usually seeking transaction.
So libertarian is beta, seeking transaction.
Yeah.
Alpha, he's the conservative. He's already proven himself, and then
wants to continue to prove himself. So that's
right.
the thing. Is that
rather than whereas the right. And then the women tend to be socialist because they need that support, being the child rearers and whatnot.
Yeah, and the conservatives tend to be production oriented. Libertarians seem to be transaction oriented. So they're looking to benefit off the transaction, the movement of goods, and their thinking is mid range in terms of
Let me sell my heroin and my drugs legally, but not care about the ramifications that those drugs have on society.
That's right. So they'll tend to be a mid range sort of decision making. They don't think 2 or 3 generations out. They don't think about the past 3 or 4 generations. That's where the conservatives come in, and the conservatives tend to have very long time horizons. They're all about protect and preserve,
and because they have children and they're providing for the wives and the children, as they should be.
Yeah, and they also tend to be the ones that rise up the hierarchy. So they want to preserve the hierarchy, even when the hierarchy is damaging. So you know what a Pareto distribution is. Pareto was the one that came up with the 80-20 rule, the 80-20 observation.
Okay.
In business, it's 80% of your transactions will come from 20% of your clients. 80% of the features, or 20% of the features in a piece of software are used 80% of the time. It's this natural distribution that comes up in everything. It comes up all over nature. So they call it a Pareto distribution. It's essentially a curve that some things converge, and they tend to converge according to this distribution. So for instance, for an operational explanation of a Pareto distribution would be, if I manage to get a little wealth, say I invent something and I sell it and I get a little wealth. Now that I have this wealth, I've increased the likelihood that I'll get more wealth in the future, because now I have money to invest. And then if I continue to do that, each time I engage in that, I increase the likelihood that I'll get more. So what happens is all of the wealth tends to gravitate towards very few people. Same thing with popularity. If you get a little bit of popularity through word of mouth and other people, talking about you, you increase your likelihood of becoming more popular in the future. This happens all over nature, where things like wealth and power tend to converge. Other things tend to disperse. But with the Pareto distribution is always going to happen. And in a natural environment that rewards the capable, so you're not going to live unless you're capable of taking care of yourself, we always have a natural hierarchy. A hierarchy will always emerge. The issue is that we get to a point where those distributions become so steep. The difference between the 1% and the rest of the population is so steep that society starts to decay, or there's not enough opportunities for young males to rise in the hierarchy, so they turn to crime. So all of these things, humans as an animal, conservatives want to protect this hierarchy no matter what, even though it's damaging to the rest of society, because that's how they got to where they are. So each one of these three has their positive and negative side to them. And what we're seeing in our political landscape is that same breakdown. So how do we have a social order that allows people that are very different, for everything from biological to sociological reasons, that we're always very different? How do we get people to get along so that, subsidy-seeking people don't turn to parasitism, conservatives don't turn to predation, libertarians don't turn to parasitism, and so on? How do we keep people within these cooperative means? Because when you understand that breakdown, it becomes apparent that, for instance, when the LGBT crew or the SJWs are seeking special rights, really what they're doing is they're discriminating against other survival strategies within the society, saying that only trying to use the rule of law to make the only survival strategy that's legitimate their own. So it's only a socialist mentality that's legitimate. We have to get rid of the capitalists. We have to get rid of the productive groups, right? And the natural leaders and so on.
The natural reproducers, for that matter, that even create themselves and the society to begin with.
That's right. So what we're talking about now is not a system that we all operate within. What we're talking about is an ecology where all of these parts need to be at play and they need to have some degree of equilibrium. And when they come out of equilibrium, so for instance, when we have a system that is conducive to parasitism but not predation, then things fall out of balance, and then that's where we see these rising societies, this parasitic behavior, these atrocities and stuff emerge, right? It's all about maintaining that ecology. And the notion of sheepdog democracy, and the democracy being based on agency, that it's no impositions upon the agency of another or the conditions to develop agency. It means that the only tolerable human interaction that we can have is one that's reciprocity. It's based on reciprocity. So any input that you've put in has to have an equal return, so that one person isn't benefiting by lying or by manipulating, or another person isn't stealing. That the name of the game is to always maintain this reciprocity. When we have that, these three groups that are very different, that also map against the classes, they map against demographics and so on, can live together. It's the one rule that allows a person that's interested in the social commons and wanting to help the poor do so without doing it at the cost of everybody else. Or a conservative wanting to rise up into leadership and produce and create social commons, do so without that being predation on everybody else, right?
Right.
Or libertarians do so without these long-term consequences that are never acknowledged. Well, the way that we do that is that we ensure that all interactions between all of us maintain this reciprocity. If it doesn't maintain that reciprocity, there's been a cost imposed somewhere, a damage imposed somewhere that we can assess and we can decide what to do about. So it's just one law that, your mining business in Northern Ontario, dumping heavy metals into the 1,000 lakes that are in the Canadian Shield, is a social imposition and a cost that needs to be paid for, right? That's not a socialist thing to say. But at the same time, to say get out of people's way and let them do business, and no, you don't have a right to people's hard-earned money, it is not a neocon thing to say either. It's true. If you start extracting people's labor from them and their wealth from them, they're going to resent it, and they're going to build systems to circumvent what you're doing, and vice versa. So how can we maintain this ecology without it turning into these class wars or these political ideological wars and so on? Well, we come to a common ground, which is don't fuck with my life, I won't fuck with your life, and don't fuck up everybody else's chance to develop a life. So don't impose on me, don't impose on the social commons.
And this is the whole notion that, comes back to everybody needs to be armed, everybody needs to be able to protect themselves. It's that meekness again.
Yes.
Understanding that, I am capable of using violence to put down violence against me. Mm-hmm. But I am not going to go out and seek violence. I am not the wolf, I am the sheepdog. Yeah. And then we have a duty to protect the sheep.
Mm-hmm. And the sheep, if they're not able to protect themselves or willing, need to pay for that protection. They need to
right, but and at the same time though, they need to recognize and not turn into little communists and feed off of the rest of the system. They need to recognize somehow that they are the sheep.
Right, and if they don't want to be sheep, then get trained, get armed. You're capable.
Well, and that and that's just again that goes back to the whole issue of leveling the playing field with arms by, trying to get everybody the trivium method, etc., just so that, and of course, there's higher philosophies and everything, but that gives everybody the foundation to understand and see and protect themselves physically and mentally.
Yeah. Now, so it talks about that we've done a pretty good job of dealing with predation in our societies. There's not a lot of physical violence as a way of coercion for the vast majority of people. I know it does happen more so in the States than here in Canada, but for the most part, we can walk down the street without, worrying about roving gangs of warlords and stuff. we haven't dealt with parasitism I was talking about. So this
Well,
introduces the
and
idea.
Canada is, one of the world leaders now in parasitism, along with the
Oh, yeah,
UK and China.
yeah,
And
yeah. It's I often say that Canada isn't a country; it's a kiosk where they sell off natural resources at the lowest price. Um, yeah, the notion of parasitism now goes back to this notion of truthfulness and testimonialism. That when you do not speak truthfully, you're imposing a cost on the informational commons that other people have to pay. So we had a conversation with somebody on Facebook, and they weren't willing to look at the facts. It's the typical story, weren't willing to look at the facts and so on. And then griped about you being rude. I'm saying, so my statement to that was that when you don't check into your opinions and you assert them as fact, you force other people to have to check them for you or to clear the record, or they go out on your word, act on that information, which would be disastrous if you were wrong. And that you have a responsibility for that damage.
well, yeah, and it's, when somebody asks you a question, if you don't have the answer and if you haven't researched it, you need to have the integrity to stand up and say, I don't know. I haven't looked into that.
Or I only know this. I'm not aware of anything else.
Right.
So that's one vector for truthful speech is a full accounting, including a full accounting of the work that you've done and the knowledge that you have. So the presupposition behind this is that truth isn't so much something that we can apprehend out there as much as it is the absence of error. What truth is the absence of error. That opens up to the idea that then what we do know right now is provisional. It's open to be updated with new evidence in the future. So
it's, and it's understanding that truth is the lack of contradiction.
Yeah,
it's the absence of contradiction.
Yeah, and there's all of these vectors that we can measure truthfulness based on. So if we were to just look at the trivium alone, so we would say that the grammar has to be correct, so it has to be a fact. You have to say that it's internally consistent, so the logic is correct. Give me some others. What else?
Well, we need to
lacks contradiction, which is internal consistency.
Sure, and then make sure that the presentation and the rhetoric is accurate, along with full accounting, along with the grammar and the logic. Okay. But it has a feedback loop built into itself. Because it should always be seeking out errors. If any new information comes in, you don't presume to know the information until you've checked it and compared it to the grammar that you've already gone through and the logic that you've already gone through. If you do find an error, then you can update it. But if you've checked it properly in the past, it can either typically be disregarded or it should be able to fit right into one of the existing categories.
Right. But that's only 3 vectors. That's only 3 criteria that we're going on. Right. So all we're saying is that it has to be fact-based, so it has to be grounded in reality somewhere. Our thinking about it has to be internally consistent, so it has to be logical, and we have to have a full account of it. What about existential consistency? Is your understanding of it operationally correct? Is it actually real? And how is it real? So that's another vector, right? If you're dealing with sociological systems, is it morally consistent?
Right. When it plays out in society, is it going to operate? Is it going to create social tension and social degradation? And then what's next?
Well, I mean, what else is left? Social degradation, is pretty much the end all of all of it, right? So it's this notion that criteria, we can elevate this from a criteria of 2 or 3 things. And for the most part in philosophy, it's only really 2 things. It's grammar and logic. And if you're a Platonist and a rationalist, it's only internal consistency. So there's only one criteria. We can raise that criteria to about 7 different things. Now, if you can argue a case and made up against all seven of those check boxes, then you can claim to speak truthfully because you've done the due diligence to check off every possible area that you can fail at. So, is it falsifiable? Is it parsimonious? Are you overloading it by bringing in a bunch of facts that may or may not be relevant, or do you not have enough facts? So there's all of these criteria that we can add in to ensure that we're not getting it wrong, that we're not falling for our own bias, we're not being deceitful. It makes it impossible to be deceitful. Well, if we had this notion, testimonialism or something along that lines, uh, as a social value that was legally enforceable, parasitism wouldn't be possible because parasitism relies on informational manipulation. I thought you would like that.
I do like that, and it's well, there's so many ways we can go with that because that's what we've been exposing on the show for the last 6 years is this social manipulation and parasitism.
That's right.
And getting people to think they're free because of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right?
Right, or even just things like bad nutritional information.
Right.
Very few people know about the ramifications of chemical stents in cardiovascular disease, and how high carb diets contribute to that. Well, how many people have died since the 80s based on that advice?
Well,
that is a real cost.
We'll go back even further, and when they introduced vegetable oil in the 1910s and when they introduced Crisco and all of this stuff, and these parasites told people, don't eat lard, don't eat your bacon grease, don't eat that stuff. That stuff's bad, even though you're all healthy and there's no disease. Mm-hmm. And you need to eat our vegetable oils and then eat our margarine and eat these toxic trans fats. And by the way, meat is the cause of the disease. So eat more grains, which cause the disease, coupling with the vegetable oils, and now the lack of vitamin K2 from not having enough meat and eggs. Mm-hmm. And then you have all of these people dying. But if you go all the way that far back, you can see that it was an agenda, and they created a sick industry out of it. And then
they did it because we have no defense against parasitism.
We have no defense against parasitism, and people didn't have the critical thinking, the logic to go through and see how they had flipped, using Kabbalistic inversion, flipped everything backward and told people the exact opposite. If you eat more whole grains and more legumes, you're going to be healthier and healthier and healthier. And meanwhile, people are fatter and fatter, and that's because the inflammation from all of the lectins and these things goes through the roof, and then they don't have enough fat in their diet to fight it, and then their system shuts down. It's like this guy that I started off reading talking about that went from 569 pounds down to, he said he hit 380 and then went back up, but here's a knock at him. You got to be honest with yourself. You got to be consistent with reality. If you know something is a lie, you have to stop lying to yourself because, it's not just grammar, logic, rhetoric. It's mind, body, spirit. It's knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. All of these things combined. But when you're consistent with reality, and stop lying to yourself that these things are okay for you to put in your body, you will heal. And it's if we're consistent with the application of this stuff on society, it will heal.
And when people are pushing this stuff at us, it's a violation of natural law.
All of it on each level, and it's just microcosms of these macrocosms, and it's like we just need to see each one and unlock it and understand it so that we can approach it head on. Do you think that we stand a chance at pulling this off before they cube the world, before they enslave us all?
Like I said, I go back and forth on the not only the notion of reversing it, but maybe actually forcefully changing it. And I'm not hopeful on that front. So I don't think we can rise up and change it, but I go back and forth. I think that, well, whether it's hopeless or not, we still need to. I
Well,
mean,
yeah, I mean, it's like when you're hopeless and backed into the corner, that's when you're most likely to lash out.
it still needs to be done. So am I just being a libertarian by saying that and backing away from
Yeah.
it?
Well, yeah, be careful calling you. I mean, the thing with the libertarians is even their logo is a serpent,
Yeah. And then the other notion is maybe we can change it slowly, get back into the institutions, make changes. Don't think that's even possible. The system is too entrenched to a particular survival strategy now. So,
well, it seems like what we have to do is figure out a way to attack parasitism first and foremost, right?
That's right, and that's the crux of the whole thing.
And that's Marxism, communism, Zionism.
It's lying in any form. It's lying and getting things wrong in any form. But when we've talked in the past,
when it's like that quote. I don't know. I could never source it, but Gene thought it came from the Buddha, possibly, but. When only one remains ignorant amongst us, they bring the whole of the world down with them.
Yeah. So this is why I focus on remnant, because every other possible outcome, say we fight and we die, we infiltrate and succeed, or we fight and survive. In any of these situations, we still must have a remnant. We must always be working in a remnant, whether it's peaceful time, when there's no threat, when there is a threat, when there is a decline. We've outsourced our social fabric to academics and politicians, and we've conflated the notion of society with our government. We've conflated the notion of culture with our entertainment systems. We need to take it back. We need to deconflate those, take it and say, it's mine. I have to take responsibility for it. And then maintain educating our kids on holding that with a strong conviction, because no matter what the scenario, a remnant must be present. The backbone has to be there, and it has to always be there.
But what's interesting is natural law. That backbone is always there. They can try and hide it and cover it up, but it always seems to percolate back up.
Yeah, and essentially what it comes down to is that when we see something that's unjust and pisses us off, unless we're seeking an advantage and lying to ourselves, we're seeing natural law being broken. So that goes back again to that notion of testimonialism and truthfulness, is that you can think that you're right about something, and under it, really all you're doing is seeking your own survival strategy. So you have to get rid of your own bias and your own deceit and see through that before you can see the truth. Or else you're just participating in the nonsense that's breaking that natural law.
Now, let's see. In between you and you, in the last couple of weeks, we had Clint Richardson on.
Yeah.
And, of course, you said woof in the audience last week about doing a show with Clint and getting into this. But, some friends and I've got, one sitting down here, I've got a 1611 Bible sitting here. But we've been going through, what do you think about Clint's notion? And he was the first one that pointed it out to me, but it's also not very original. I posted a video on Facebook yesterday of a Christian group pointing out, and Clint pointing out, that the Bible is actually natural law, especially the New Testament. But we've been going through it, and, I've been astounded at how much is actually natural law when you take it out of the context of religion and these deities, and it's like, it doesn't matter if Jesus was real or not. That misses the whole point of the story. Mm-hmm. It's like the whole thing is about what you were just saying, truthful testimony, standing in truth. And, there's a whole section in there, what is it, John 10, about, being the shepherd for all the sheep, Mm-hmm. So it's like these concepts are all in there, but it's been, they've twisted it into arguing over whether these characters were real or not, or historical or not. and they've gotten away from the whole point, I think, of what it really is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you know, it's interesting because when you read in the past, people would say, well, if you were a Christian, you could not be enslaved. And I think that's because originally the idea was, you know, in my mind, from what I've studied of it, there's this, the story is about this hero character, and his name is Jesus, and he's figured out this natural law stuff and truth, and that there are no contradictions in nature. And he can see all the crap, and he goes around and he calls people out, and then they're like, you know, we got to shut that guy up. And he's like going around telling everybody how to do it, right? And then at the end of the story, they kill him, and then, you know, it's all about the moral of the story, but every point he makes is about natural law, and then directly after that, a comment about truth. And then he's talking about how, you know, and in the Trivium, Gino Denning used to talk about how truth in the center was subverted with God or do. So if you get that truth and God are the same, are synonymous, then he's just saying, I'm in truth. And then it's like, you know, forget these beings and all of this stuff. Just realize it's a hero story, and he's talking about truth.
Yeah.
And tell the truth. Tell, you know, he says, you know, don't slander, you know, don't do your buddy's wife, don't do all of this kind of stuff. Act in natural law. Don't cause commotion in society. So I think if, you know, anyway, I just wanted to get your feedback on what you think of understanding the Bible as natural law and getting away from the concept of it as religion.
Well, and I think it's a brilliant idea, and I would also suspect that you could probably look at find other historical documents and find natural law in there.
I would agree with that. You know, it's just, I think, you know, reading it and going through it recently with the understanding that Clint's brought about, you know, looking at it at natural law, you know, it's like, no wonder why it was the greatest story ever told, because it was about natural law and finding truth. You know, not about beings, not about, you know, here's a thing that I realized going through this constantly is, you know, the concept of Jesus raising the dead, in my opinion, and I know this is going to upset a lot of people out there, wasn't about physically raising people from the dead. He's talking about deadheads, waking people up. You know, it's like, hello, you know, hey, man, and I was given this thing over here on a Sabbath day, but I woke this dude up, so you're going to tell me it's bad because I woke this guy up, you know, and I did work on the Sabbath? Oh, but this guy woke up. He's no longer dead. He's in the living now. He got it. You know, so... You know, so it's just, I think if people got away from the, you know, and I think it was done intentionally, is to get people to focus on arguing whether Daffy Duck is real or not. Jesus is real or not, instead of understanding Daffy Duck's story or the story, the hero story that Jesus is putting forth. And, you know, we talked about heroes in the last episode, and, you know, it's like when you get that Jesus is the hero and just laying this stuff out, and he can see everybody's crap and he's exposing it, and he's like, you know, the users at the temple, this stuff is out, you know, that's against natural law, this is against natural law, et cetera, et cetera. It's, you know, to me, it's all right there.
You know how I teach my daughter about God? Because my mother-in-law, her Nana is quite religious, and she participates in the church with her Nana a lot. So I didn't want to be, you know, pounding atheism into her head or deism or anything else. Operationally, the only evidence that we can find of God that isn't explained some other way is that it's a belief within humans. Now, for something to exist, it means that something has to be measurable. It has to have an impact of some sort that we can measure. Well, when people have a belief in God, their behavior changes, and that impacts the world, and that's a measurable change, which means that God exists. That means that God exists. And we know God exists through the behavior of people.
Here's something, you know, this goes to, and this is going to go on another line of thought. It's like I was just saying, and like Gino Denning taught me many times. This is my new 1611. I just got to go as far back into it as I could. But is the idea that if we stop thinking of God as just God, this word, and think of it as logos or the word or truth, then the whole perception changes. Because when we consider God as logos, and then logos is in action, anything that ever was, is, or could be, then we solve the problem of the noun, we solve the problem of the verb,
Yeah.
and then we have consistency. But it's also saying, there is a natural law here.
Well, if you're going to measure gods now, let's say, okay, so a God exists through the effects that its believer has. So I'm going off God as being a noun now. Now we have a way of assessing which gods are good or bad.
Well, but here's the thing: is if God is truth,
yeah,
and only truth, only the word, only the logos, then it always
which is consistent with nature.
Which is consistent with nature and always brings it back to natural law.
So if you're talking about false gods, well, let's look at the impact that believers of other gods have.
Which is why they were called false gods, because they weren't seeking truth, right?
Right. So now you get into something that now you can assess those belief systems, those gods, based on the impact that it has on its world through its believers. Right. And that was a notion after we did the meditation video. I was researching the social impact that Buddhism had versus other religions. And I think it's underrepresented by 4% or something like that. But the one that was off the charts was Protestant Christians. Protestant Christians were less than 30% of the world's population, but account for almost 70% of the NGOs across the world. And then it's like that, no matter how scientific or materialistic or skeptical you want to be, that's something you can't ignore.
Yeah.
That's a whole lot of people that are doing a whole lot of good work in their communities based on a belief system, whether we want it verified by our criteria or not. That impact's real. We shouldn't ignore that. Well, how do you get people believing these things without maybe meeting our criteria that can have such a positive impact? Well, the beliefs must align in a way that allows it to have a positive impact on the world, which would mean that it aligns with nature somehow, right?
Right.
So if you're talking about Buddhist gods being protectors of the path and all of that nonsense, how does the belief in that deity have any impact on the world at all? Well, it doesn't. If anything, it just takes your mind out of it. But if you're believing in a Christ story that is a hero that's pointing a way on how to behave, that has a positive impact on you and the people around you. That's
so, well, and just to drive this point home, and I've never done this before, ladies and gentlemen, I am actually, forgive me, Bill, I'm going to read live from the 1611 King James Bible. But this is John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, so that's just, it's logos. It's the Word, and the original word was logos. And the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him and without him, so made by the Word, or the logos, and not anything made that, and was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. In other words, not the dark, the light, the path of truth. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. So the lies couldn't understand the truth. And let's see, there was a man sent from God whose name was John, and the same came from a witness who bare witness. Okay, so here we go, bearing witness. The word, the truth, bearing witness, all right here in the beginning of John, that all men thought him might believe, and he was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of the light, to bear witness of truth. that, and here it confirms that interpretation. That was the true light, which was lighteth every man that cometh into the world. And so when you go through and you just think of these concepts as truth, word, logos, natural law, wash and repeat, suddenly, it's not this contradictory story of this guy, walking on water and raising the physical dead. He's waking up deadheads. He's like saying, come on, dummies, come on, wake up, you're asleep, wake up. And hey, man, I woke this guy up today, man. Check it out, guys. Listen to this story. He got it. He got Bill's analysis of natural law. Woohoo!
Yeah. That's very cool.
So anyway, that was Agnostic Media first.
Mark the date.
10/10/2017. All right, so what I want to do is maybe in the next week or two have you on with Clint. Are you down with that as soon as we get that organized?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, like I said, I'm coming from a very different angle, but we're coming to similar conclusions, at least how to be in the world and what the world needs. So there's got to be something there, right? If you're coming at things from different angles like that and they're cross-verifying, I think it's worth a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, because if it's natural law, that's what should always be happening, is we're arriving at these conclusions, even if we're looking at them from different spokes on the wheel.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, at the end of the day, it's a matter of clarifying that definition of what natural law is, so that it's not subject to interpretation and overloading and deception and error and bias and all that other stuff, so that we know it in a truthful way. Yeah.
All right, so let's see here. Thanks to Hamish for making a donation today, and thanks to anybody. I haven't gone to the website or to the email to check yet. If you made a donation today, please support the show, gnosticmedia.com. Please throw Bill some donations for all of his hard work and study to bring all of this out. And
no, I work for a living. You don't have to give me donations. You can give me feedback. That helps. Right?
Well, you could probably use donations sometimes too to help out, yeah. But it's always anyway, good to support you, and thanks for coming on, Bill. And have anything else you want to add before we part?
No, I don't think so. I'm a little tired today. I was working a little late, so I feel a bit off my game. So if anybody's noticed that, I apologize. But
well, they do now because you mentioned it.
Okay.
All right, man. Have a good night. Good night, everyone. See you next week. Take care, and until next time.
Take care.